This is the face of a necrophiliac. Necrophilia is a perverted sexual behaviour where the perpetrator gets pleasure having sex with the corpses. In February 1983, a drainage engineer was called to a house in Cranley Garden, North London, to deal with some smelly block drains. Little did he or anyone else know, they were about to uncover the crimes of a serial killer, Dennis Nilsen. Before we start, I'd like to say a special hello to all of those first-time viewers. If you enjoy true crime, then you're in the right place because that's what we are all about. So please consider hitting the subscribe button and like the video. Now onto the video. Dennis was a reclusive man who raped and dismembered at least 15 men and boys between December 1978 and February 1983, and he did this right beneath the noses of his neighbours. He was born on November 23, 1945 in Fraserburgh, Scotland. His father, Olav Magnus Nilsen, was a Norwegian soldier who escaped to Scotland after his home was conquered by Nazis in World War II. His mother, Elizabeth Duffey White, was a daughter of a local fisherman. Elizabeth married Olav in May 1942. They had 3 children, 2 sons, Olav Jr. and Dennis, and a daughter named Sylvia. His parents' marriage wasn't a happy one. Olav Nilsen did not view married life with any seriousness, being preoccupied with his duties with the Norwegian forces and making little attempt to spend much time with or find a new home for his wife. After the birth of a 3rd child, Nilsen's mother concluded she had rushed into marriage without thinking. The couple divorced in 1948. As a result, Dennis, his mother, and his siblings lived with his maternal grandfather, with whom Dennis had a good relationship. Dennis claimed that his beloved grandfather's unexpected death when he was just 6 years old and a traumatizing viewing of his corpse at the funeral led to his later behavioral psychopathology. He became a recluse and would reject any help. His favorite activity was to travel to the harbor alone and watch fishing boats as they arrived and departed. During one of these trips, Dennis found himself submerged in the water and was almost dragged out to sea. He panicked at first, but once he ran out of oxygen, he had a near-death experience, causing him to calm down and believe his grandfather was coming to get him. He was eventually pulled out of the water by some youngsters. The death of a parent or a loved one, like the relationship between Dennis and his grandfather, is a highly stressful life event for bereaved children. Several studies have shown an increased risk of mental ill health and psychosocial problems among affected children. Couple this with his sexual confusion, which we'll get into a little bit later, and it's not hard to see this boy had already experienced a lot of trauma at such a young age. Perhaps this untreated damage manifested as he matured and led to the events that followed. Dennis's mother found love again and remarried with Adam Scott. She had 4 more children, leaving Dennis a withdrawn and lonely child. Dennis's life really took a turn for the worse once he hit puberty. He was really confused. He wasn't sure if he was gay, bisexual, or heterosexual, because the boys he was attracted to at school looked suspiciously like his sister. Rural Scotland during the 1950s was a dangerous place to be openly gay. In fact, it was still illegal to be gay in the UK in the 1950s. It wasn't legalised until 1967. Dennis needed to validate his curiosity. Dennis molested his younger sister Sylvia. He said that his sister looked similar to some of the boys he was attracted to, and after molesting her, he decided that his attraction to his classmates was really just a weird manifestation of his feelings for his sister. Late one night, he fondled his brother while he was sleeping. But his brother woke up in the middle of the act. Olav Jr. began to think that his little brother was gay. Since then, Olav Jr. would bully and publicly out him, calling him a hen, which is Scottish slang for a girl. Dennis felt stifled and ostracised, so he decided to leave home and join the Army Cadet when he was 14 years old. Dennis finished school in 1961 and enlisted in the Army with the intention to train as a chef and began training with the Army Catering Corps at St. Omer Barrack in Aldershot in southern England. After passing his catering assessments, he was deployed to West Germany, and this is where Dennis began drinking heavily. He did this to reduce his shyness and help himself socialise. One time, he passed out and woke up on the floor of an apartment owned by a German friend. No sexual activity took place, but this was a trigger for Dennis Nilsen's fantasy about having sex while one of the parties was mostly immobile. Dennis would pretend to be passed out during later drinking sessions, hoping for someone to make sexual advances on him. Following 2 years in West Germany, Dennis returned to Aldershot where he passed his final catering exams. He was then deployed a year later in 1967 to Aden, South Yemen, and assigned to Al Mansuri prison. He served as a butcher in the Army Catering Corps, learning skills that served him so well during his 5-year killing spree. Several of Dennis's companions were abducted and murdered by violent and pro-independence groups. Dennis himself was nearly abducted by a local taxi driver. The man knocked him unconscious and placed him in the trunk of his car. But when the boot opened, Dennis managed to overpower his kidnapper and then lock the taxi driver in the boot of his own car. His posting in Aden was different to his previous deployments in that he's had his own room in the barracks, allowing him to explore his sexuality. This is where he learns about his necrophiliac fantasies. In order to confirm his sexuality, he hired a prostitute so he could have intercourse with a woman for the first time. Dennis found the experience overrated and depressing and concluded he was most certainly homosexual. Dennis returned to his family home in Strinchen while he worked out his next career move. But this stay did not go well. His mother constantly badgered him about not being married with children and his general lack of interest in female companionship. A few months later, Dennis and his brother attended a group watching of a documentary on male homosexuality. This was certainly going to return an interesting outcome. After the documentary finished, everyone present spoke of the subject in contempt except for Dennis, who defended gay rights. A fight broke out between Dennis and his brother, and after its conclusion, Olav Jr. told everyone that Dennis was a homosexual. This led to an estrangement between Dennis and his brother, and in December he left Stritchen for London to join the Metropolitan Police. He never spoke to his brother again and maintained only a very sporadic contact with his mother and sister. In April 1973, Dennis completed his police training and was posted to Willesden Green as a junior constable. Although Dennis enjoyed his new job, he missed the camaraderie of the army and began drinking heavily again. He also began to visit gay pubs and clubs from the summer of 1973 onwards, and engaged in numerous one-night stands, but he viewed these encounters as soul-destroying, and he longed for a serious long-term relationship. Dennis came to the conclusion that his professional life as a police officer and his homosexuality would not work. The police force is notoriously homophobic, and Dennis wasn't comfortable working in an environment that depicted men as strong, powerful law enforcers and felt ostracized as a homosexual. He eventually resigned from the police force in December 1973. He took on a job as a security guard, but the work was intermittent and he was looking for something more stable, so he became a civil servant and was initially posted to the job centre on Denmark Street in London, West End. He was a quiet employee. His attendance record was mediocre, but he was good at his job and would often volunteer for overtime. Dennis had several sentimental relationships over the next few years, but they all failed, and he once again began drinking heavily again. By late 1978, Dennis was living a very solitary life and had come to the conclusion that he was impossible to live with. There have been many speculations for his failed relationships. Some say Dennis Nilsen was just a very boring person and eventually bores people until they leave. Other people say that his drinking was a huge factor in isolating him from others, and that if he had stopped drinking or at least cut down on the amount he was drinking, he would have been a much more pleasant person to be around. But in December 1978, Dennis Nilsen would make sure nobody would ever leave him again. He became increasingly disturbed by his sexual encounters, which only seemed to reinforce his loneliness when they were over. The only way he could solve the problem was ensuring nobody would ever leave him again. Dennis met 14-year-old Stephen Holmes at a pub in North London and invited Stephen back to his flat. Police interviews report that Dennis made it clear that he believed the boy to be around 18 or 19 years old, and he was not targeting underage boys. It's comforting to know that Dennis wasn't completely messed up. He had standards too. All his victims had to be adults. Okay, I know that was a bad joke. Moving on. The two spent the night drinking in Dennis's flat, and the next morning when Dennis woke up to find the boy still asleep, it was this moment where he decided this boy would spend New Year's Eve with him whether he wanted to or not. While sleeping naked together, Dennis's heart was pounding. He looked beside the bed to the pile of discarded clothes and spotted a necktie. He took this necktie and strangled Stephen until he fell unconscious and then drowned him in a bucket of water. Dennis was known to be a necrophile and masturbated twice over Stephen's body and then hid it under the floorboards. 8 months later, he burnt the body in a bonfire in the garden. On October 11th, 1979, Dennis attempted to murder a student from Hong Kong named Andrew Ho. The pair had met in St. Martin's Lane pub, and Dennis lured Andrew to his flat by promising sex. Dennis attempted to strangle Andrew, but Andrew managed to flee from the flat and reported the incident to the police. Dennis was questioned by the police, but no further action was taken. It took Dennis 7 weeks to find his next victim. This victim was Kenneth Oakenden, a 23-year-old Canadian student who was travelling around the UK. The pair met on December 3rd, 1979 in a pub in London's West End. Dennis's interest was piqued when he learned that Kenneth was a tourist and offered to show him around, acting like a tour guide that knows all the right sights and landmarks around London. He then invited Kenneth back to his flat on the promise of food and drinks, which Kenneth accepted. After drinking rum and whiskey, Dennis strangled Kenneth with the lead from a pair of headphones. The next day, Dennis bought a Polaroid camera and posed with Kenneth's body in various sexual positions and then sat the corpse on the sofa and talked to him as he watched TV. Dennis wrapped the body in plastic bags and hid it under the floorboards. He dug up and reburied Kenneth's body 4 times. Dennis's third victim was 16-year-old Martyn Duffey from Birkenhead in northwest London. Martyn was a runaway and also homeless. They met on May 17, 1980. Dennis met Martyn at a train station in London, and he was actually returning from a conference in Southport, which is fairly close to Liverpool where Martyn was from. Martyn travelled to London just 4 days earlier. He had been questioned by British Transport for evading fares and ended up hitchhiking most of the journey. In what seemed like an act of compassion, Dennis offered Martyn a place to stay, and being cold, exhausted and hungry, Martyn willingly accepted Dennis's invitation. Dennis waited for Martyn to fall asleep. He then strangled him with a ligature and sat on his chest until he fell into unconsciousness, and then drowned him in the kitchen sink. Dennis bathed the body and kept it in the house for a few days. He performed sex acts upon it. He kissed it, complimented and masturbated over Martyn's body repeatedly for 2 days. And almost like the body had an expiration date, it started to bloat, so Dennis buried it beneath the floorboards. Dennis's criminal activity increased in August 1980. After trying to spray the bodies with deodorant and insecticide to eliminate maggots and flies, he dismembered the bodies and burnt them in a waste ground behind his home. In October, when Dennis's landlord decided to renovate the property, Dennis disposed of his latest victim and moved to an attic flat in 23 Cranley Gardens in the suburb of Muswell Hill. Dennis refrained from committing murders for a while because he did not have access to a garden, nor did he have enough space under the floorboards. I thought about this for a while. The fact that the place Dennis chose to live in lacked the amenities he needed to continue his murderous rampage suggested that this was a gross oversight or an attempt to force Dennis to stop murdering. I actually believe that Dennis was trying to quit and escape his deranged lifestyle. Unfortunately, he failed to overcome his disturbing sexual fantasies, and in March 1982, Dennis invited John Howlett for a drink. After John fell asleep in his bed, Dennis sat by his side and continued drinking before he tried to strangle him. John immediately awoke and struggled with Dennis, almost overpowering him. He was eventually strangled to unconsciousness 3 times. After Dennis realised he was still breathing, he filled the bathtub with water and drowned John for 5 minutes. Because he had nowhere to dispose of the body, he had no choice but to dismember it, utilising the skills he learnt in the Army Corps. Once the body was in pieces, he flushed the flesh and organs down the toilet and threw the bones in the trash. 2 months later, the scenario was repeated for Carl Stotter. Carl awoke to Dennis strangling him and was then taken to the bathtub and forcefully immersed. Satisfied that he'd killed Carl, Dennis placed Carl on an armchair. However, he realised that Carl was still alive when his dog Bleep jumped over and began to lick Carl's face. He knew this because Bleep never interacted with the corpses. Dennis decided to resuscitate Carl and later told him that he had accidentally strangled himself after being stuck in the sleeping bag zip. Over the next 2 days, Carl fell unconscious several times and he had flashes of Dennis strangling and drowning him. Carl asked Dennis about the memories, but Dennis explained that Carl would have nightmares whenever he was stuck in the zip and that he would place Carl in cold water to help him recover from shock. Dennis invited Carl to stay over again, but he declined. Dennis's next victim was Graham Allen. Graham was offered a meal and subsequently strangled while he was eating an omelette. Graham's body was left in the bathtub for 3 days, and Dennis had to take a day off work so he could dismember it. On January 26, 1983, Dennis killed his final victim, Stephen Sinclair, who was strangled while in an alcohol and drug-induced state on Dennis's armchair. Dennis noticed that Stephen's wrists were bandaged, removed them, and discovered that Stephen had tried to kill himself only a few days prior. Dennis then bathed the corpse, applied talcum powder to it, and arranged mirrors around the bed before undressing himself and lying naked next to the dead body. Several hours later, Dennis kissed the body, wished it good night, and fell asleep alongside it. The body was subsequently dismembered and the parts placed in different bags, with Stephen's own bandages used to seal them. On February the 4th, Dennis complained to the real estate agent about the drains being clogged, seemingly unaware that it was the body parts of his own victims clogging them. When plumber Michael Catron informed Dennis that he had found the drain packed with a fleshy substance and small bones, Dennis joked that someone was flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken. Michael and his supervisor returned the next morning to clear the drain, but found that someone else had done it. It was Dennis, who grew increasingly aware of the prospect of being caught, tried to cover his tracks by removing the human tissue from the drains at night, but was spotted by the downstairs tenant, who became suspicious of his actions. It was reported that on the morning of February the 9th, 1983, he told a work colleague laughingly, "If I'm not in tomorrow, I'll either be ill, dead, or in jail." The plumber Michael and his supervisor examined the pipes leading to the drain and found more bones, scraps of flesh, and 4 fingers in a pipe coming from the top floor of the house where Dennis resided. After informing the police, a pathologist confirmed that the bones were human and that one of the flesh scraps as part of a neck-bearing marks typical of ligature strangulations. As 3 officers waited for Dennis to come home, they noticed the smell of decomposition at his front door. Dennis first pretended to be shocked when the officers told him that the blockage was caused by human remains, but when they told him to tell them the location of the rest of the body, he led them to one of the closets containing remains. When asked if there were more, Dennis said that it was a long story and that he would tell it at the police station. While being driven there, an officer asked Dennis if the remains belonged to 1 person or 2. Dennis looked out of the window and replied, 15 or 16, since 1978. Dennis soon made a full confession and led officers to the lot where he destroyed the remains in Melrose Avenue. However, he claimed that he had no intention to kill until the moment right before a murder. He also claimed that he ignored the reason for the murders, adding that he hoped the police would tell him. On November 4th, 1983, Dennis was found guilty of 6 murders and 1 attempted murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole for 25 years. The possibility of parole was eliminated in 1994 by Home Secretary Michael Howard, who replaced Dennis's sentence with one of a whole life order. Dennis reacted to the news by saying that he accepted his life sentence and he had no desire to be free again. In prison, Dennis was allowed to keep 2 budgie birds named Hamish and Tweeties. The serial killer also produced 250 hours worth of tapes while in prison, co-wrote a biography called Killing for Companion in 1985 with Brian Masters, as well as his own memoir, History of a Drowning Boy, over a period of 18 years. The memoir was banned from release in 2001 and was only published on May 2021. On May 12, 2018, Dennis Nilsen died as a result of complications following a stomach surgery at the age of 72. While incarcerated at the Full Sutton Prison in East Yorkshire, England, Dennis was transferred to a hospital in York on May 10th, suffering from abdominal pains. During the procedure, Dennis suffered a blood clot and later died. An autopsy ruled his cause of death was pulmonary embolism and retroperitoneal hemorrhage. James McKeith, one of 2 psychiatrists testing on behalf of Dennis's defense, declared that Dennis had a lack of emotional development and difficulty expressing any emotion but anger, constituting an unspecified personality disorder. The second psychiatrist, Patrick Galloway, diagnosed Dennis with a borderline, pseudo-normal, narcissistic personality disorder, with occasional schizoid outbreaks that worsen as a result of social isolation. He was intellectually aware of his actions, but not of their nature. On the other hand, the prosecution's own psychiatrist, Paul Bowden, argued that Dennis was only abnormal in a colloquial sense. He was instead a manipulative individual capable of forming relationships. but who had willingly chosen to objectify people and had no mental disorder as a result. Thank you for watching. If there is a subject you like covered, please leave a comment below. Have a great day everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.